On November 2014, the Government Accountability Office published a report on efforts to combat trafficking on U.S. government contracts overseas, entitled Human Trafficking, Oversight of Contractors, Use of Foreign Workers in High-Risk Environments Needs to be Strengthened, is the title of the report. The GAO investigators spoke to migrant workers on U.S. contracts overseas who had paid an equivalent of up to 1 year's wages to unsavory recruiters in order to secure their jobs. So, as we're talking about trafficking and modern-day human slavery, it is pretty mind-boggling that on U.S. government contracts we might have an iteration of that. So how does state ensure that U.S. government contracts overseas are not used as a vehicle for trafficking workers?
Thanks for that question, Senator. We are leading, for example, and we have begun in the context of the executive order that I mentioned in my testimony, working first and foremost on our internal supply chain. So as of the executive order and similar provisions in law, federal contractors and subcontractors, as well as their employees, are prohibited from deceiving employers about key terms and conditions of employment. They're prohibited from charging employees recruitment fees, and they are prohibited from denying employees access to their identity documents, as well as a host of other things.
When's the date of that executive order?
I'm sorry?
When was it?
I'm not sure, to be honest, I'm not sure how to pronounce whether it's 13627 or whether it's 13627, but those are the numbers of it. It's the Federal Acquisition Regulation Rule that implements Executive Order 13627. So this is something that has been implemented in order to address precisely these kinds of problems. Federal contractors now will need to certify that they have their compliance plans in place, and they will be conducting in-depth mapping of their supply chains, expanding control over recruitment schemes, making available safe and independent grievance mechanisms, and we'll continue to be engaging on this issue, including in the context of our ongoing work to develop a national action plan on responsible business.
All right. Well, I'm informed that this was, the executive order was even before the GAO's report, but as in anything, enforcement, we can have all the laws in the world and all the executive orders in the world. It's enforcement that matters in order to send a very clear message that we would, as a government, not tolerate in our own supply chain having that. So I hope we're going to pay particular attention to that. How does the Department of State work with its partners to strengthen source country policies, for example, places like Bangladesh and Nepal, that to prevent fraudulent recruitment practices? Because in the previous hearing that we had, it was the whole, a big element of these recruiters are a big part of the challenge we have here. And so, do we have any specific focus on that?
We do, although it is, yes, we do, and it is both an issue of bilateral concern, but it's also an issue that we support in a more integrated way, but we are not directly running that process. So let me walk you through that. We engage with both sending countries and with destination countries to underscore their responsibilities under the Palermo Protocol and to combat trafficking. And so that's a dialogue, the content of which is contingent on which country and what the circumstances are. But in addition, we have been encouraging those countries to have a dialogue between both sending and destination countries about how the issues interact with one another. So, for example, the Colombo process is a nascent dialogue that has been developed between the Gulf countries and the South and Southeast Asian nations. A subset of that is the Abu Dhabi dialogue, in which we are just beginning to facilitate that kind of exchange. And this is an ongoing area. I think it's an area, frankly, Senator, that we're going to be spending more time on and more attention to, because we're looking at some big focusing international events coming up that will provide a very useful forum to raise some issues that are very important to raise. And so it's an area in which I'm looking forward to engaging with others in the State Department to focus more on.
Okay. Now, the Trafficking in Persons report we've all recognized is a significant tool in our efforts here. And the chairman referred to the fact that we have no ambassador at large in that role. So I assume that your answer to him is that you're personally going to protect the integrity of the trip report overall, and especially with regard to particular countries that may be subject to intense political pressure within the building?
Yes, I was involved in the process last year. I'm very proud of the process that transpired last year. I look forward to participating in a similarly, in a process that has similar integrity this year.
Are there particular countries whose trends you find concerning?
I think it best to say that we are compiling data on the countries, and that it's very hard for us to identify trends until we get the full amount. As you will be aware, at the end of a reporting period, we tend to get a whole lot more data than we necessarily got along the way. So I think it might be premature to talk about trends, but I think in general, we've seen trends going in both directions, and that's one of the biggest advantages of having the annual report process, is that we're able to then reflect that in the findings.
I hope when you do the report that you would share with the committee insights as to trends that you see developing, which, whatever those trends may be, would be very helpful. Finally, according to the State Department's own Trafficking in Persons report, the government of Cuba does not fully comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking and is not making significant efforts to do so. It continues to be a source country for adults and children subjected to sex trafficking, and conscripts doctors and medical personnel to work overseas under conditions that resemble forced labor. As a matter of fact, that happens to be the #1 source of income to the Castro regime, is forcing doctors to go abroad and work, and then having the payment for those doctors sent back to Cuba. So between that and Voyeur magazine had an article, Sex Trafficking Capital of the World, several years back, about Cuba. Can you tell me whether or not trafficking has been raised and prioritized throughout the administration's new engagement with Havana?
Yes, absolutely.
And how so?
So first of all, we have been in an ongoing dialogue with Cuban government officials. We've met on multiple occasions over the past year to share information on efforts to combat human trafficking. And we expect that that engagement will continue and deepen over time, because we do share a commitment to addressing it. But as you said, government complicity in trafficking is one of the most nefarious and troubling aspects of trafficking in persons. And so that doesn't mean that this will be an easy conversation, but it will be, as all dialogues are, frank and open. We would like to take advantage of any opening that we have to prompt the Cuban authorities to make progress on trafficking. But the problems, as you pointed out, are severe.
I would note, Mr. Chairman, that the Secretary's response suggests that the government is complicit in trafficking, and that makes it all the more, in my mind. One thing is to have a blind eye to what is happening in your country. The other thing is to be complicit in the trafficking, and that's the reality of Cuba. Thank you for your answer. I want to follow up on Senator Cardin's, because it boggles my mind sometimes. And I know at your confirmation hearing, which I was privileged to chair, you're eminently qualified for the position. But sometimes in an institution like the State Department, you have to have sharp elbows. And to hear the answer about Malaysia, as by way of one example, as we are negotiating, I mean, it should be that we have already raised the questions of countries that are on the TRIP report that we are contemplating negotiating with as it relates to a trade thing, because the fact of the matter is that it undermines our moral authority to say that we're willing to do business with you, but on this question, well, you're on our list, but we're willing to do business with you. That's a tough proposition. So I would hope that you would take a more activist role in looking at how you take your TRIP report, which I think is, we all agree, is a very powerful tool, and look at other elements of our government to make sure that we are in harmony with what we're trying to pursue. Otherwise, whether it be contracting, whether it be negotiations for trade or other elements, I think we erode the very essence of what we're trying to pursue. And so in some respects, I don't want us to be duplicitous in the way in which we look at this, because otherwise I'm not sure that we're going to achieve a goal that I know the chairman is very singularly focused on here, and which I share his views on. So it's an observation from my part.
Senator Menendez, I think it's an excellent point. I do want to clarify that we do distribute the TIP report. It's very much part of the whip and wharf of the State Department. Typically, and this, I don't mean this to be a pedantic bureaucratic answer, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that people are unaware of the report, or that the issues, for example, the case of Malaysia people have not discussed it in the context of trade. I was asked a question about whether I had. So the bureaucratic way this would work is that the regional bureaus, which work on all elements of a given country's issue, are very much aware of the TIP report, because they're very deeply engaged in the adjudication process every year. They are very aware, and they're working with the trade bureaus. So I think it's an absolutely important point, and I take Senator Cardin's exhortation for us to go and add an additional conversation from a functional lens. But those conversations do happen. They just happen separately, and I didn't want to be speaking for the department as a whole rather than my own role.
So, and I understand what you're saying, but let me maybe try to crystallize my point. That a regional bureau raises the question or knowledge that the TRIP report says this about this country who you're negotiating with is one thing. That the undersecretary for this position raises that at a level that is more among equals is a much more powerful set of circumstances.
Point taken.